The winter of 1959 was unforgiving in the Ural Mountains of Russia. A blanket of deep snow covered the vast remote landscape. It was here, in this frozen wilderness, that a chilling mystery began to unfold. 9 experienced hikers, mostly students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, embarked on a challenging expedition. Their goal was Mount Otorten, a peak whose name, in the local Mansi language, ominously translates to "Don't go there." They were young, adventurous, and well prepared for the harsh conditions they expected to face. Little did they know that their journey would end in tragedy, leaving behind a puzzle that continues to baffle investigators and thrill-seekers alike, even today, on May 27, 2025. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student and a seasoned trekker. His companions included Georgy Krivonyshenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Yudin, who would turn back early, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were all skilled in winter camping and cross-country skiing. Their trek was classified as a Category 3 expedition, the highest difficulty rating at the time, a testament to their abilities and the seriousness of their undertaking. Their laughter and excited chatter filled the train carriages as they set off, full of dreams of conquering the formidable Urals. Their destination, Kolatsyakal, or Dead Mountain, lay nearby Mount Otorten. This particular slope would become the group's final campsite and the epicenter of the enduring mystery. The events that transpired on the night of February 1st or 2nd, 1959, remain shrouded in uncertainty and speculation. What could have caused 9 experienced mountaineers to abandon their tent in the middle of a freezing night, inadequately dressed, and meet such bizarre and terrifying ends? The questions began to pile up as soon as the search parties stumbled upon the first clues of the disaster. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, as it came to be known, is more than just a tragic story of hikers lost to the elements. It is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of strange injuries, inexplicable actions, and tantalizingly scarce evidence. The official investigation at the time concluded that an unknown compelling natural force was responsible for their deaths. This vague explanation only fueled the myriad of theories that have emerged over the decades, ranging from the plausible to the paranormal. The story continues to grip the public imagination, a chilling reminder of the unknown terrors that can lurk in the most desolate corners of the earth. The adventure began on January 23, 1959. The group of 10, brimming with youthful enthusiasm, departed from Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg. Their initial leg of the journey was by train, a chugging, rhythmic start to what they anticipated would be a triumphant expedition. They were headed towards Ivdel, a small town nestled in the northern part of Sverdlovsk Oblast. From Ivdel, their plan was to travel by truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before the vast, snow-covered wilderness that guarded the approach to Mount Otorten. Their spirits were high, documented in their journals and photographs, capturing moments of camaraderie and shared anticipation for the challenges ahead. Upon reaching Vizhai, the group prepared for the most arduous part of their trek. They would now rely on skis and their own strength to traverse the frozen landscape. It was here, on January 28, that one member, Yuri Yudin, was forced to make a difficult decision. Plagued by severe back and leg pain, a flare-up of a pre-existing condition, he knew he couldn't continue. With a heavy heart, he bid farewell to his 9 friends, wishing them luck. This decision, born of physical necessity, would ultimately save his life, leaving him as the sole survivor who had embarked on the initial journey, albeit not to its tragic end. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on, their determination undeterred by the harsh environment. They were a cohesive unit, familiar with each other's strengths and weaknesses, a crucial factor for survival in such demanding conditions. Their diaries and photographs from these early days depict a group working well together, navigating through dense forests and across frozen rivers. The entries spoke of the beauty of the winter landscape, the physical exertion, and the simple joys of camp life. There was no hint of the terror that awaited them, no premonition of the inexplicable events that would soon unfold on the desolate slopes of Syakhl. Their progress was steady, following their planned route towards the imposing Mount Otorten. They were well equipped with supplies, a sturdy tent, and the knowledge gained from previous expeditions. The plan was to reach the peak and then return, sending a telegram to their sports club by February 12th to signal their success and safe return from the wilderness. This telegram would never be sent. Instead, a period of ominous silence would descend, eventually triggering an alarm that would lead to the discovery of one of the most perplexing mysteries of the 20th century. By February 1, 1959, the Dyatlov group had made significant progress. They found themselves on the slopes of Syakhl, a mountain whose name in the local Mansi language translates to Dead Mountain. This ominous name, though perhaps a coincidence, now seems like a grim foreshadowing of the events to come. Their original plan might have been to make camp on the other side of the pass, but deteriorating weather conditions, possibly including strong winds and poor visibility, likely prompted them to set up their tent on the exposed hillside. This decision, made in the face of adversity, was not unusual for experienced hikers. The weather that evening was undoubtedly harsh. Temperatures would have plummeted well below freezing, likely reaching -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, accompanied by biting winds. However, the group was prepared for such conditions. They had a robust, military-grade tent designed to withstand severe weather, along with warm clothing and sleeping bags. Diary entries recovered later indicated that they were in good spirits, even producing a satirical newspaper called The Evening Otorten the night before. They prepared their evening meal and settled in for the night, unaware that it would be their last. The last known photograph taken by the group shows them diligently setting up their camp on the snowy slope. There's a sense of routine and order in the image. The tent is being erected, skis are planted in the snow, and the vast, empty landscape stretches out around them. Inside the tent, they would have felt a sense of security, a temporary refuge from the brutal elements raging outside. What happened next, sometime during the late hours of February 1st or the early morning of February 2nd, remains the central enigma of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Something, or someone, caused these 9 seasoned hikers to make a decision that defies all logic and survival instinct. They cut their way out of their tent from the inside, using knives, and fled in a state of apparent panic. They left behind their warm clothing, shoes, supplies, and equipment, essential items for survival in the frigid Ural winter. Whatever occurred was so sudden and terrifying that it compelled them to abandon their only shelter and rush out into the deadly cold, some of them barefoot or clad only in their night clothes. The Dyatlov group had a pre-arranged deadline. They were expected to send a telegram to their sports club at the Ural Polytechnical Institute by February 12th, signaling their successful return from the wilderness and the completion of their ascent of Mount Otorten. When this date passed with no word, initial concern was mild. Delays were not uncommon in such challenging expeditions. Weather could slow progress, or minor issues could cause a day or two of holdup. Friends and family waited, hoping for news that would alleviate their growing unease. However, as more days slipped by without any communication, the mild concern began to transform into genuine alarm. Igor Dyatlov was known for his punctuality and reliability. The prolonged silence was out of character for him and for such an experienced group. By February 20th, nearly a week after the expected telegram, the families of the hikers and the Institute authorities could no longer ignore the ominous absence of news. It was clear that something had gone wrong, and a search and rescue operation was officially launched. The initial search parties consisted of volunteer students and teachers from the Institute, many of whom knew the missing hikers personally. They were driven by a desperate hope to find their friends alive, perhaps injured or stranded, but safe. The vastness of the Ural wilderness, however, presented a formidable challenge. The area was remote, difficult to access, and covered in deep snow. Soon, the civilian efforts were bolstered by the military and militia police forces, who brought in airplanes and helicopters to scan the endless expanse of white from above. For days the searchers combed the area around Mount Otorten, battling freezing temperatures and difficult terrain. The initial sweeps yielded nothing. The sheer scale of the search area was daunting, and without precise information on the group's exact location, it was like looking for a needle in a colossal frozen haystack. The mood among the search teams grew increasingly somber with each passing day that brought no sign of the missing 9. The hope of finding them alive began to dwindle, replaced by a growing dread of what they might discover. So, here we are in Section 5, The Abandoned Tent, First Chilling Signs of Trouble. On February 26, 1959, nearly a month after the hikers had last been seen alive, the search teams finally made a breakthrough. Mikhail Sharavin, a student searcher, spotted the group's abandoned tent on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. The sight that greeted them was both puzzling and deeply unsettling. The tent was partially collapsed and covered with snow, but it was clearly their distinctive, large canvas shelter. It was situated on an open slope exposed to the elements, a location that some later questioned, though not entirely unusual for avoiding avalanche-prone lower areas. The most alarming discovery was how the hikers had exited the tent. It hadn't been unfastened in the usual way. Instead, the canvas had been slashed and cut open from the inside. This immediately suggested a desperate, panicked escape. Why would experienced hikers in the middle of a freezing night cut their way out of their only shelter rather than using the normal entrance? It pointed to an urgent need to vacate the tent as quickly as possible, as if fleeing an immediate and overwhelming threat that was perceived to be inside or directly upon them. Inside the tent, the searchers found a scene of eerie order amidst the chaos of the forced exit. Most of the group's belongings and equipment were still there: warm clothing, boots, sleeping bags, cooking utensils, and even their food supplies. Maps and diaries were also recovered, along with Igor Dyatlov's camera. The presence of these essential items indicated that whatever had caused them to flee, it was not a rational decision to brave the elements. They had left behind the very things they needed to survive the brutal cold, suggesting a flight driven by sheer terror rather than reasoned action. 9 sets of footprints were found leading away from the tent, heading downhill towards a dense forest about 1.5 kilometers away. Some of these footprints were made by bare feet, others by feet clad only in socks or a single boot. This further confirmed the suddenness and desperation of their departure. The footprints were visible in the snow for about 500 meters before disappearing, covered by subsequent snowfall. The direction of their flight, away from any potential shelter and into the even deeper cold of the forest, only deepened the mystery. What could have instilled such fear? Section 6. Grim Discoveries Under the Cedar. The First Victims. Following the trail of footprints from the abandoned tent, the search party made their way downhill towards the edge of the nearby forest. About 1.5 kilometers from the campsite, under a towering ancient Siberian cedar tree, they made their first horrifying discovery. The bodies of 2 of the hikers, Yuri Krivonyshenko and Yuri Doroshenko, lay side by side. The scene was grim and perplexing. Both men were stripped down to their underwear despite the sub-zero temperatures, which would have been around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. The men were barefoot. Near their bodies, the remnants of a small fire were found. It seemed they had desperately tried to build a fire to ward off the incapacitating cold, but the branches used were small, and the fire had clearly not burned for long or provided much warmth. The hands of both men were abraded and scraped, Krivonyshenko's particularly so, suggesting they had been trying to gather wood or perhaps even climb the cedar tree. This was a desperate struggle for survival against an invisible enemy, the relentless, killing cold. Adding to the macabre scene, branches on the lower part of the cedar tree were broken, some up to 5 meters high. This indicated that someone, likely one or both of the men, had attempted to climb the tree. Were they trying to get a better view of the tent, or the surrounding area? Were they trying to escape something on the ground, or perhaps gather more substantial firewood from higher up? The broken branches spoke of frantic activity, a last-ditch effort in the face of overwhelming odds. The initial examination of Krivonischenko and Doroshenko suggested they had died of hypothermia. This seemed plausible given their lack of clothing and the extreme weather conditions. However, the circumstances of their flight from the tent, their state of undress, paradoxical undressing can occur in severe hypothermia but usually at a later stage, and the attempts to climb the tree raised more questions than answers. The discovery of these first two bodies was a tragic confirmation of the searchers' worst fears, and it was only the beginning of the grim tableau that would unfold. Section 7. The Trail of Death. More hikers found. The search continued with a renewed sense of urgency and dread. Having found Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko beneath the cedar tree, the searchers began to meticulously comb the area between the tree and the abandoned tent. It was here, scattered along a direct line pointing back towards their camp, that they discovered the next three bodies. These were Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Their position suggested a desperate final attempt to return to the relative safety of the tent they had so hastily abandoned. Igor Dyatlov was found about 300 meters from the cedar tree, lying on his back, his head pointing towards the tent. One arm was clutched around a small birch sapling, as if he had been trying to pull himself up or steady himself in his final moments. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found furthest uphill, about 630 meters from the cedar, closer to the tent than Dyatlov or Slobodin. Her body showed signs of a fierce struggle against the elements, her posture suggesting she had been crawling towards the camp when she finally succumbed. Rustam Slobodin was found between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, his face buried in the snow. These three hikers were slightly better dressed than the two found under the cedar tree, but their clothing was still woefully inadequate for the brutal nighttime temperatures of the Ural winter. They wore some layers but lacked proper outerwear, hats and gloves. Slobodin was found to have a minor skull fracture, though it was not initially deemed fatal, and like the others, his death was officially attributed to hypothermia. The injuries found on Kolmogorova were mainly abrasions on her face and hands, consistent with falling and trying to protect herself in the icy, rough terrain. The discovery of these three bodies painted a heartbreaking picture of a desperate struggle for survival. They had fled their tent in terror, found themselves in a life-threatening situation due to the extreme cold, and then, perhaps realizing their fatal error, attempted to fight their way back to shelter. But the freezing conditions, the darkness, and their inadequate clothing proved to be insurmountable obstacles. Their strength failed them one by one on that desolate slope, leaving them frozen in their final, agonizing efforts to live. The mystery of why they fled, however, remained as opaque as ever. Section 8. The Ravine's Secrets. The final four and their puzzling injuries. For more than 2 months after the discovery of the first 5 hikers, the fate of the remaining 4 members of the Dyatlov group remained unknown. The spring thaw was beginning to set in, gradually revealing what the deep winter snows had concealed. On May 4, 1959, the search teams finally located the last of the missing hikers. Their bodies were found buried under 4 meters of snow in a den-like hollow within a ravine, about 75 meters further into the woods from the cedar tree where Krivonischenko and Doroshenko had perished. This discovery would add even more bizarre and disturbing elements to the already baffling case. The 4 hikers found in the ravine were Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon, often referred to as Alexander in some reports, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were comparatively better dressed than the others. It appeared they had managed to scavenge some clothing from their deceased comrades who had succumbed earlier. For instance, Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of Krivonishenko's woolen trousers, and Zolotaryov was found wearing Dubinina's fur hat and coat. This suggested a grim sequence of events where the survivors tried to utilize any available resource in their fight against the cold. However, it was the nature of their injuries that truly shocked investigators and set this case apart from a typical mountaineering tragedy. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered massive internal chest trauma. Multiple ribs on both sides were fractured, akin to injuries sustained in a severe car crash. Semyon Zolotaryov had similar extensive chest fractures. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had sustained a severe crushing skull fracture. Crucially, medical examiners noted that these internal injuries could not have been caused by another human being, as the force required was too great, and there were no corresponding significant external soft tissue injuries or bruises. Adding to the horror and mystery, Lyudmila Dubinina was found missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and some facial tissues. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs. While some experts suggest that these particular missing parts could be attributed to natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals in a wet environment, as they were found in a den with running water, the explanation did little to quell the unease. Furthermore, traces of low-level radioactivity were found on some of the clothing of these last 4 hikers, particularly on Zolotaryov's sweater and Dubinina's clothing. This discovery opened up a whole new avenue of speculation about what truly happened on Dead Mountain. Section 9. Unraveling the Enigma, Theories, Investigations, and Lingering Questions. The official Soviet investigation in 1959 concluded that the hikers died as a result of an unknown compelling natural force. This vague determination did little to satisfy public curiosity or the grieving families, and instead fueled decades of speculation. One of the earliest and most persistent theories is that of an avalanche. Proponents suggest a slab avalanche could have struck the tent, causing the hikers to cut their way out in panic and sustain some initial injuries. However, critics point out that the tent was not completely buried. Items inside were largely undisturbed, and the slope was not typically considered steep enough for a major avalanche. Footprints also led away from the tent, rather than showing signs of being swept away. Another theory involves infrasound low-frequency sound waves that are inaudible to humans but can supposedly cause feelings of intense panic, dread, and nausea. Some speculate that wind passing over the topography of Kholat Syakhl could have generated infrasound, driving the hikers into an irrational frenzy. While intriguing, there is limited concrete evidence to support infrasound as the sole cause for such extreme actions and the specific pattern of injuries. The severe internal trauma found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibault Brignol remains particularly difficult to explain with this theory alone, unless they fell into the ravine during their panicked flight. The discovery of radioactivity on some of the clothing led to theories involving secret military weapons testing in the area. Some eyewitness accounts from other hikers and locals around that time mentioned strange orange spheres or lights in the sky, fueling speculation about rockets, missiles, or even UFOs. The idea was that the hikers might have stumbled upon a secret test site or been accidentally exposed to an experimental weapon, causing their flight and subsequent injuries. The Soviet authorities' swift classification of the case files further fed these conspiracy theories, suggesting a cover-up. However, the levels of radiation detected were relatively low, and their source remains debated. Despite numerous unofficial investigations, documentaries, books, and even a 2019 reopening of the case by the Russian prosecutor's office, which ultimately reaffirmed the avalanche theory, albeit a specific type called a slab avalanche combined with poor visibility, no single explanation has definitively accounted for all the bizarre elements of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Why cut the tent from the inside? What caused the terrifying internal injuries without significant external trauma? What was the source of the radiation? Why were some hikers so inadequately dressed? The questions linger, and the slopes of Kholat Syakhl continue to hold their secrets. making the Dyatlov Pass Incident an enduring and chilling enigma in the annals of unsolved mysteries.